Hello, welcome back. So, in this episode, as I promised a couple weeks ago, I'm going to be talking about aliens, grays, little green men and women, whatever you want, whatever your favorite flavor of alien is. So, and the reason why I think I was going to devote, why I think it's important to devote an episode to this is because basically aliens and humanity's interactions with them have been a huge part of science fiction almost since its inception. Um, I would venture to say the vast majority of science fiction stories um, include aliens to one degree or another. And our interactions with these alien species actually provide a pretty good chunk of the sort of the driving storyline, the conflict for a lot of science fiction. Um, so if you're one of these people that's going to be incorporating aliens into your universe, the world that you're building, I think it makes sense to actually think a little bit about how you're going to go about that. And before doing that, I think it's important to actually look at kind of the mindset that or sort of a lot of us unconsciously are coming from to kind of examine, the sort of the baseline where we're starting when we start talking about aliens. So in order to do that, I am going to go ahead and pull up some of the famous aliens that have provided sort of the baseline for our modern culture and take a look at them. So to start with Star Trek, it's again one of those really early. It's this series has been with us for so long at this point that I think it's kind of had a huge impact on science fiction and how we write and think about it. So here, obviously, main species, we've got Vulcans, right? Alien species. Um, First thing you notice is that they're essentially humans with pointy ears, right? So let's go a little further into it, and let's now we've got Klingons, another major species. Again, you're still looking at humans, except this time they've kind of got weird brow ridges. So I can think that you can see right off the bat, and not all of the Star Trek aliens fit this sort of humanoid template, but the vast majority of the aliens that we dealt with and interacted with, and that formed a large part of the show in the Star Trek universe, were humanoids. And they actually had a reason in the story for that, which I'll get to in a little bit. Um, but it's worth actually considering that this is the way that they went when they were starting to talk about alien species, and it's something that I think has stuck with us from the inception. But it actually gets beyond the Star Trek universe. Let's go to Star Wars and look at some of the alien species that come up here. Um, Star Wars, I think, does a better job of getting beyond that sort of humanoid template. You'll notice that there's, for example, a lot more variety in the facial construction of it. But again, when you look at a lot of these species, they're still in that sort of general humanoid template: two legs, two arms, and a face. And there's again a lot more variety in the Star Wars universe, I would say, than the Star Trek universe. And I'll get into that a little bit. And then actually, I'm going to talk about that now. So why is that? I don't think it's any lack of creativity on the part of the writers like Gene Roddenberry or the people that or George Lucas or any of these people. I think it boils down to, first off, budget. It's a lot cheaper, at least it was back then, a lot cheaper to just put a human actor in a costume rather than creating some sort of complex animatronic alien. Um, and then also for audience engagement, it's a lot easier for us as humans to engage with something emotionally, to get involved in the story if it's got a face and eyes. And that's really, I think, those two main reasons are why we started off with that kind of humanoid template. Um, Again, Star Trek didn't use the humanoid template for everything. I think, the black blob that ate Yar in season two or one or whatever. Uh, but in general, that kind of humanoid template has stayed with us when we've thought about aliens and put them into our stories. Um, but not all. So let's go to another one of my favorite movies, Starship Troopers. If you haven't seen it, it's kind of campy but fun story uh, based on a book, which is actually similar but not 100% similar to what came out in the movies. But this is the alien they came up with. Bugs, basically. And you can see here that it's not using the humanoid template in any way, shape, or form. It's also interesting to note that we're not intended to emotionally engage with these things because these are the bad guys. These are the things that are killing people. So, and I think that brings us to another thing. The more alien the species is, the more likely it is that we're not going to be interacting with them in a positive manner by any stretch of the imagination. So we'll come back to this in a second. So what does this tell us? I mean, it tells us that, you know, when we're writing science fiction, and this is actually something that comes up a lot in like say movies or TV shows, anything that's visual, but even a good bit in books. When we start thinking about species, we tend to think about them in forms of at least initially, as a humanoid, especially if we're supposed to engage with this species in any meaningful sense beyond just killing them. Um, and then if we do actually have aliens that we fight, they tend to be more alien than the ones that we're going to be interacting in a positive way. So think about that, why we approach that. So you want to include aliens. You want to you recognize this kind of past is how we've done it, and now you want to actually create something brand new for your universe. Well, the first thing that I would think about is, and it's not boring, believe me, is biochemistry. So I'm going to preface this by saying I am in no way, shape, or form a biochemist. So this is going to be very kind of shallow a treatment of it. And I do not present myself as an expert on this. But when you talk about biochemistry, you're basically talking about the molecular basis that your alien species is built on. And most of us are, you know, first off, we're kind of hampered because we really only have one biosphere that we can study, which is Earth. Um, but most of us are familiar with carbon-based life. And the reason for that's very simple. Carbon is fairly common, I would say, at least on terrestrial planets, probably in the universe. And the chemical properties of carbon tend to lend itself to creating complex molecules. It's stable, but you can actually make it unstable with chemical reactions. So it's something that you can use to build complex molecules like DNA and all that stuff uh, with. And it kind of lends itself to that in a lot of ways. So if that's what you're going to start with, that's going to actually, kind of inform how your aliens are going to, where they live, how they're going to, what they'll sort of look like in some ways. Um, probably look like crabs, most of them, but in general, if you start with a carbon-based life form, uh, you're going to be having aliens that look a specific way and can interact with the universe in a specific way. But I would actually encourage you to look maybe beyond carbon life forms a little bit, or at least think about it. Um, there are, and carbon, as far as we know with life, is probably the best biochemical way to make it. But silicone, for example, has been thrown out over the years as maybe another alternative. Um, Not nearly as good at making these complex molecular chains as, say, carbon is, but there's some people that think if you had a very cold environment, for example, a frigid environment, that silicon actually could support life there. I think boron is, I mean, you can Google this stuff. There's different chemicals that have been thrown out over the years as maybe plausible candidates for supporting complex life. So I would actually spend a little bit of time thinking about that. Do you want your aliens to be silicates? Do you want them to be carbon-based? How would that kind of inform how they look, how they live, how they interact with the universe? Okay. The second thing to think about is, are they alive in the classical sense or not? Now, this you might be thinking, well, that's a stupid question, Ian. Of course they're alive. They're flying spaceships and bombing Earth, right? What else are they going to do? But I think spending a little bit of time thinking about what exactly you think life is and what it looks like is worthwhile. Um, and I'm going to use a real world example, viruses. Are viruses alive or not? They replicate, they actually evolve, but I think most biologists out there would consider them as not being alive just because they don't have cellular structures, for example. I think that's one of the main reasons that they use. But in a lot of ways, we seem to be kind of defining ourselves, just using a definition to get ourselves out of this kind of tricky question. Because if you were an alien coming down to Earth, didn't know anything about Earth, and you looked at viruses, you could conceivably think that they were alive, just like, say, a bacteria is or a human, right? So if you start thinking about what life looks like, that actually opens up things way beyond just biochemistry. Um, could, for example, life look like a cloud of interstellar dust that somehow manages to replicate itself? Could it be an energy pattern? I mean, if you start thinking about life beyond that sort of just biochemical template, I mean, you can open up all kinds of vistas of different types of alien life, um, if you wanted to. And that again brings up a whole another series of questions about how are humans, your hero species, for lack of a better term, going to interact with these things? Would they even recognize if they're alive or not? Okay. And then that brings us to the last thorny question. So you've got life. How are you going to know if it's intelligent? What barometer are we going to use to measure intelligence? And honestly, we don't really have a good answer for that for our own biosphere. I mean, are dolphins intelligent? Are our dogs intelligent? Are cats intelligent? I mean, I think cats certainly think they are. Um, but are octopuses intelligent? I mean, it's the we really don't have a good definition of it yet, I would say. Um, but um, considering if you're alien species, how do they show that they are intelligent? How with how they interact with the universe do we know that they're intelligent? Or what form does their intelligence take? And that's obviously going to be contingent on, the biochemistry and, you know, the life, where they live, where they've developed. And the literature and the movies are rife with we've got Contact, for example, which is a really good movie. But it's rife with examples of that kind of struggle to figure out, okay, A, is this thing alive, and B, is it intelligent? And then once you've determined that, how do you actually communicate with it? And that struggle is been kind of an ongoing thread, I think, especially in what was considered sort of heavier sci-fi. But honestly, I don't think even if you're writing just sort of light sci-fi, this is a question that you can just kind of blithely blow off. Think about it a little bit. Even if your aliens are just coming down to bomb the hell out of, like Independence Day aliens, um, they're coming down to just bomb the hell out of humanity. Um, why? Why are how does their biochemistry and all that stuff not only affect their civilization, but how they're interacting with us? I think it's worth spending at least a little bit of time thinking about that. And, even if you're writing a story, just stick it into stick a paragraph in there, something like that, just to explain it. But I think in general, most of us are probably going to go with carbon-based life, just because it's something we're more familiar with, and it provides us easier avenues of creating interactions between our characters. But I actually do want to show. Let me share something real quick again. Give you an example of, let's say you're talking about silicate life. Think about how it would look. This could be a silicate alien. Looks like what is a target gate or whatever you call it. Um, how are you going to determine if something that looks like maybe a boulder that moves a centimeter a day or whatever is alive, et cetera, et cetera. This is something to think about if you're going to be using different biochemistry. But if you are using carbon-based life, remember that the varieties of carbon-based life are pretty endless. It's not nearly as constricting as I think you might think initially. This is obviously just our biosphere. There's an octopus, you know, and if you had a octopus that was smart, clearly not bipedal, not a humanoid in any way, shape, or form, um, but you could conceivably make this thing smart, and a good alien from there. So I think the possibilities with carbon-based life are pretty much endless. Although the kind of saying goes out that yeah, things tend towards evolution tends towards creating crabs for whatever reason, just because they're a really efficient shape. Um, so, so yeah. Okay. So, decided to go with, and I'm actually going to use this as an example of how great, how in depth and complex you can get, even if you're just using carbon. In fact, even if you're just using terrestrial species as your kind of baseline for your aliens. And that's the Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I'm not going to spoil the story for you at all, but he starts with a terrestrial species, makes them intelligent, and creates an amazing story out of it. So yeah, if you're interested in how kind of the heavy science fiction author handles creating alien life, I think that would be a good way. Um, But let's get beyond that. Let's say that you really want to have an alien species that humans, your main characters, are going to be able to easily interact with, um, get emotional attachments to, create an emotional attachment with your audience easily. Um, so in order to do that, you know, I mean, you can do it with species that are like octopi, for example. But if you don't want to spend a lot of time, you know, because if you are going to be creating a emotional interaction with octopi, you're going to have to spend a lot of time in your story kind of describing their civilization, how they view the world, etc., so that you can actually create that emotional connection with your human characters. And those make for great stories. Don't get me wrong; those are awesome stories. But let's say you don't want to do that. You actually want to kind of you want to center your story around the humans, and kind of create easily identifiable interactions with an alien species or multiple alien species. Easiest way to do that is like they did in Star Trek and Star Wars. Um, go with humanoids. Go with bipedal humanoid aliens that your audience can kind of easily relate to. Um, but how would that make sense in the universe? Because when you think about it, there are so many different environments out there, uh, aquatic environments, all these sorts of things that, kind of creating bipedal species seems like it's going to be a giant leap of faith on the part of your readers and viewers. And again, people do it all the time and with great ease. So don't think that that's not a good way of approaching it. But if you do want to explain that, what's a good way to do it? And Star Wars, or no, actually, Star Trek actually did a good job of that. I believe it's in season 6. They had an episode called "The Chase," where Klingons, I think it was Cardassians, and the Federation went around, um, and tried to answer this question: Why are we all bipedal? And it turned out that all the major species in this area of the galaxy, at least, were descended from one progenitor race or species that had billions of years ago or whatever seeded this part of the galaxy with their DNA to create uh, intelligent life. And because they were bipedal, we're bipedal. I'm not going to get into how how you would do that if you were if genetic science and biology is there, but yeah, sure, it's an example, and it works. Interestingly, it works a little bit with the alien universe too, because you've got the engineer species. It's also bipedal, created us and aliens and all that stuff. So the core concept of that is bipedal species make sense if they are us, if we can trace ourselves back to a common ancestor. And I think that makes the most sense from a logical standpoint if you want to create humans and have us interacting with another bipedal species, is actually have us share a common ancestor, however far back. And it has a lot of advantages. You can put a face on these aliens, which makes it a little easier, especially if you're doing, TV or media, uh, to create that emotional interaction. And generally means that you can kind of you don't have to worry. You still probably want to create their foreign civilization a little bit to make it distinct and interesting. But in general, you don't need to have to spend as much time describing it to actually make sure that your audience is being able to emotionally engage with these things. Because again, we're kind of starting off as being familiar with. Um, so how would this, and you can go back to a common answer. You can go back to say like, Neanderthals were kidnapped by aliens or whatever. But I think another way of doing it is actually saying that, yeah, we're starting as baseline humans like right now. And then when we colonize space, that's when we start getting this genetic drift and we start looking different and all this sort of thing. And that's actually what I did in Regnum Humanitas. And it's actually not that much of a stretch because even right now we have, first off, you've got basic evolutionary processes, which are natural. Of course, they take a while, but um, I don't know. We can look at it right now. Like people that live at high altitudes in the Andes, for example, are a lot better at, they can live with a lot less oxygen than say people that grew up at sea level. And since they've been doing it for generations, it's like a part of their physiology at this point. But when you bring genetic engineering into the mix, you can actually speed that process up a lot. And we're not there yet, but you can kind of see we're on the cusp of being able to genetically engineer all kinds of traits into embryos. Um, and I think once we get, if we ever start colonizing other planets, that push to create, to bioengineer traits into humans is actually just going to be increasing to the point where I don't think we'll be able to resist it. And you get a little bit of this in the Expanse, for example. In the first episode of the Expanse, you see that there's one low gravity person there, and I think they've got like a balloon head and they're very tall and slender. But again, I don't think that they didn't really show up too much beyond that first episode just for budgetary reasons and the fact that again it's going to be a lot harder to bring those sort of ethereal alien looking humans um, into your story. But the way I did it, and again, this civilization is based on the solar system, is if we colonize, say, Europa, the tendency would be to say bioengineer humans that are a lot more resistant to cold, uh, amphibious because they're in an aquatic environment, people that grew up and lived in the asteroid belt, for example, um, you know, were a lot, didn't have the muscle mass or bone density of say somebody that grew up on Earth. Um, and as you start getting into different ecosystems beyond the solar system, these things are, these changes are just going to accelerate. I mean, think even if you found like a planet that was very Earth-like, almost perfectly Earth-like, um, even if there's small fluctuations in, say, gravity, which is the main one, if a planet is slightly less dense than, say, Earth, the people that are going to develop on that are going to look differently over a period of time than the people who grew up on Earth. And these changes would just accelerate the longer that these two populations are apart. So that provides a really plausible basis for having bipedal aliens. Is that these are basically just humans that migrated to another biosphere ecosystem and have stayed there for multiple generations. Um, so you can either have evolutionary pressures changing them or bioengineering. So, but what if you actually wanted to keep humans more human? Let's say you wanted to make sure that the human species didn't get so crazy that your audience can't connect with them easily. Um, and you could see that happening fairly quickly, especially if you got like humans that have colonized, say, aquatic world. I mean, would they not look like seals, after a couple of generations? And how easy is it to bring those into your story, et cetera? Um, so if you want to do that, you can always explain it by saying that humans are psychologically unwilling to get beyond a certain basic template. And I think that's plausible as well. Um, and I think my next episode, I'll talk about kind of how plausibly different alien species can interact with each other in their own biospheres. But in general, keep in mind that there is going to be that kind of fear of the other and kind of wanting to keep the species pure, for lack of a better term. It's kind of been an ongoing psychological impulse in humanity for a long time and led to all kinds of nastiness between us. Um, but do keep in mind you have that tool if you do want to keep your species roughly human looking. But I would actually encourage you to get a little beyond that to an extent, just because it makes for an more interesting story. So yeah, there it is. If you want to create aliens, consider the biochemistry, consider what you want your life to consist of in your universe, and actually what barometer you're going to use to measure intelligence, and how your different species are going to actually determine that they're intelligent or not. For example, in the Ender's series of books, Ender's Game and all those, the fact that one species didn't even consider that the other one might be intelligent, well, led to a war, kind of horrific one. So that's something to consider. And then, if you do want to create kind of that easy engagement with your audience and with the alien species, consider basically having a common ancestor is the way to do that. I think that actually kind of works best. Okay, so that's all I've got. I hope you find this useful. I'll give you some things to think about before you start designing your aliens. And you have a good day.